Satamne, Didan Tobala Nalu Tarji Jidan Tade, Karu Yung Gowayang, and you do Tama Jeba. Chinese, Teda Gowading around to Dejan, and she knew great Yamne. Yitabana, that Pumbo di, Pumbo Korandang, Nalu Daji, Jitutu, Pumbo Jitu Nawana, Pumbo Dang, Pumbo Koran, Jitu Nawana, Pumbo Chigresha, Jitu. Pumbola so you church and Pumbo Deda, Nalu Daji Tada to Dube. Any that Dube, Choke, then Mebaji mind in a mato, you chinjela, and a Jida Tata Karule, you Kanule Mateba Tache. Oh, so you chinjela, you know, Jida Tata Karu.
So here it says then that when we're doing this here, and we first of all determine the I as it exists in that way that it appears to us, and then we also have to be able to form a visualization or to see the mere universal of one's own aggregates that continuously appear to us, thinking that these aggregates, which are the basis of designation of the I, and then visualizing seeing the aggregate, the I, and the aggregates. Then those two definitely, in the way that they appear to thought, necessarily have to appear either as identical or as different, one of those two. And so there, one doesn't want to immediately determine this, whether they're identical or whether they're different. One doesn't do that immediately. And the reason for not wanting to do that immediately is that if one focuses one's mind such that one thinks that having looked at it in that way, that one already understands this, then one won't be able to engage in the analysis that follows. So therefore one has to look at the aggregates and sort of look at the way the aggregates themselves and the way they appear as a single thing. The aggregates, which are the basis of designation for the I, appear as if they're a single unitary thing when we're doing this process of designation upon them. So therefore, you have to have both the I and the aggregates as a single thing, aggregates as a single thing, and then one's trying to ascertain what the relationship between the two is, whether there's an identity, they're identical, or whether they're different. And then, this is so other things that are other phenomena, which all of the other phenomena, such as pots and so forth, which could appear in the same way that the aggregates do, they appear as separate from the aggregates. That is, other phenomena like pots appear separately from the aggregates. And that being the case, unless something was totally non-existent, if it exists, then it has to appear such that it's either identical or different. There's no third possibility other than those two. If there are two things, if one has two things that are appearing, they have to have either an identity relationship such that they're identical, or they have to be, things have to appear differently. Let me restate that. If something exists, then it either has to appear such that it's a singular, identical thing, or it has to appear, if it's two different things, has to appear such that they're different.
Oh yeah, and it Jenny that 대능아 오도데 세데 다 다시 공도 샤바나신 체니 라라 펜이 아니 라라 펜바 슈침보 춘인지 펜바 슈침보 춘이 가서 침보 깨위냐가 아니 라라 녀바 체위냐가라 아니 아오 냠바 공도 깨기 아 슈침보 차에 공도 가서 공도 샤바나신 체니 아 마인 비체 현다 마제바 아 유디니 아니 차야 돼. 어디 차주 다 디나가서 차야 돼. 디래서 아주 디니 차야기. 땅한 것도 이게 다야게我一年不去用算是什么我的我做的是真的才跟我做的大西碰不当那路大几个人的他的人 직도 나와 다시 품보는 직도 나왔다 나루다지 직이나 안에다 끼었으면 거래 아 품보다 직이나 나루다지 직다 나 직도 나왔다지 직이나 아 품보다 끼었으면 거래
So here then again when it has created a image or a vision of the eye such that it is appearing like the authentic or actual eye. And again, the way we did this was by reflecting or remembering, reflecting on or remembering an incident in which one did something especially significant, and the way in which the eye appeared in that context, or in a context where some great harm had befallen you, some injury that had occurred to you. How did the eye appear in that situation? So that way in which the eye appears in those kinds of situations is the actual eye that one is wishing to investigate here. And so that sort of genuine eye or actual eye is what one is going to look at. And then if that eye appearing as an object in that way was identical, rangi dakshi pongbo didang nangluk targi chikimpa.
다시 만들어 랑은에 유동디 차와디 이유이 전에 마도와 체스 다시 야라 제송아 된다 이 좋아 다디 하고서 언제 다진 다가래 좋아 팬이 중이 체 아니 가 간지 차고 와래서나 아니 가서디 나한테 간지 차고 와래서나 공도 셔바나시 최선다 말림바 아니 랑은에 라왕도 차와기 차주디 차비 아니 나한테 된다지 나고도 됐을 거.
So here then the eye, again we're specifying that the eye is appearing in that way, and the eye is appearing as if it has the kind of autonomy that it that it naturally appears to us as having, that it exists in that sort of autonomous fashion, which is the way it appears in those conditions when we, the ones that we specified, where if we've done something especially wonderful, then we have that sense of I, as if the I was sort of like an autonomous thing standing on its own, or when some sort of harm has befallen one, and when one has that vivid sense of I, ego, or self that is appearing that way. So then one examines whether or not that kind of I is, in the way that it appears, is identical with its own basis of designation, the aggregates. And if it is identical, then there's three problems that arise.
Oh yeah. That didn't care about how you doing the kind of thing or is and tender working water 아니 풍분 등이 안 풍분이 오데 나루다 지지이나 아니 도발라 지도 나고 그래 지도 나나 나 동어 타대도 나와고 그래 지금 동어 타대도 나와도 로도나 대단한 예와 때문에 바기 지긴배 예와 때문에 그 지긴배 아니 풍보래 로수 아니 다들 나와로 도저히 가래 예와 때문에 지긴배 아니 풍보라 로수 아니 풍보 도와당 겨알 돌린 셔바크 풍부 렘바다 풍부 도와를 셔바크 안에 다케랑 바디 퇴요와 말이 스타디 풍부 남산점도 셔바레 도와당 렘바
이 그사 딱
풍부 돌린 셔바
이 동올라
오뱅오 타데도 나와도 로고레 찍도 나나 동을 타데도 나와도 로고레스 대도나 되니 이와 때문에 그 찍인배 아니 풍보래 로소 아니 풍보도 내체바 그 다케랑 바도 되면레스.
So here then, what one is examining is how it is that the I appears within the perspective of the thought that apprehends it. Is it appearing such that it's absolutely identical with its basis of designation, the aggregates? If it was if the I existed such that it was identical with its basis of designation, the aggregates, then various forms of problems would occur. Deni nanguk target chikina, topa chiktu.
나루다 지지나 도발라 찍도 나고 그래스 도발라 찍도 나나 안에 도병고 타대도 나와도 놓고 그래스 좋아 도병고 타대도 나와도 놓고나 다더니 도병고 타대도 나와 로바 인장 타대 예미기대 아니 더니 여와 때문에 지인배스 좋아 여와 때문에 그 지인바 인장 아니 풍보래 로수 아니 풍보 돌려 집에 다开了 봐 때문에 다 가짜래 무슨 자꾸 말이지. 가짜래 무슨 맞아 돈다지. 그래서 이따지 이거 순서와 가서세 다이가 순서와 펜 쳐가지고 순서 다시 어디 돼서 가요. 다시 타냐 수바도 랑신시비 타냐 수바도 돈에서 좋아 누가 다다가라라 다다다지 튼지 가서 랑신시비 타냐 수바도 돈에서 와 어디 나 남지 돈도 잡아 도스단 거 아래
Yeah, I know. I just didn't catch what you said last.
남지 중시라 제가나 다다 풍부니 오데 오지그레스 오지이나 라신지 주용 오지그레스 라신지 주용 오지라 안에 타다 때문에 지금 고그레스 타다 때문에 지이나 다다 판탐 타마님 다당 풍부니 오데 오지리 지인자라 라신지 주용 오지인자 다 라신지 주용 오지이나 타다 때문에 지인 고레 타다 때문에 지이나 안에 단다디 단도 가소래 나도 캐람바 테메 요 말이 풍빈나란 주도 세비치 전에 다지 요새 그 숨긴나라 돈다 투스단 거래 그래서
So here then what one is examining is this again relationship between the I or self and the aggregates, which are its basis of designation. And if they were intrinsically existent, then it would have to be the case that they're either intrinsically identical or intrinsically different. If they're intrinsically identical, then various forms of unacceptable consequences or irreconcilable faults would arise. So, and here we're talking about the way in which the I and the aggregates appear to us normally. That is not when we're examining their ultimate nature or trying to ascertain their actual character or final nature. So here then, in the first case, if the I and the aggregates were identical, then just the holding that there is a self would be completely meaningless. That irreconcilable fault would obtain. Here, if they were identical, such as Teni nangi luktagi chikina. Teni nangluki tak.
나누다지 찍이나 안에 또발라 찍도 나고 그래. 좋아. 또발라 찍도 나도 가나 찍도 나나 안에 또빙 올라 찍도 나인다 타자게 나와도 놓고 그래.
So if those two were such that they were identical and that they were to appear in that way, then it would necessarily have to be the case that they would appear identically to thought. And if they were to appear in that way, then one would have to eliminate the possibility that they could appear separately within the perspective of thought. And if that was the case, then there would be absolutely no way to differentiate the two. They would be identical such that they would be undifferentiable. And then that being the case, then it would be meaningless or pointless to accept a self which is apart from the aggregates, which functions so as to take up and to cast away the aggregates, because the self would simply be a synonym for the aggregates. There would be no differentiation at all between the two.
아니 다다 풍부니 어디 이와 때문에 지긴배 아니 풍부래 로수 아니 풍부 랭겐당 풍부 노아를 챙겨기 아니 다다 캐랑바 되말에 되요 요 말에때 다다 풍비 남자 잠도 세버래 풍부의 예매 직자 사러와
So this, again, that would mean that would entail that that they would have to, if they were absolutely identical in that way, then they would have to appear to thought. To our thought in that way. They would have to appear identical. And if they were to appear in that way, then it would be impossible for them to appear separately within the perspective of our thought. And that being so, then they would be identical such that there would be absolutely no way to differentiate the two, the self and the aggregates. And then, if that was the case, then it would be pointless to posit or to hold that there is a self apart from the aggregates, etc., or apart from the aggregates, which functions so as to take up and to cast away and take up the aggregates in that way. And then, that being so, then. Or the reason for that is that the self and the aggregates would be synonymous. They would be exactly the same. So in terms of the way they're conceived, the way we identify them, the way we talk about them, they would be identical.
Oh, that's it. I thought I was going to change it. You know, Lemba Matobi, Daya Mai Chavish. You know, Lenny Diana, Chicky Dani Meba Yancy. You know, Lemba Pumbo Mato Bagi. 아니 다메나 다여봐 많이 재밌지 아니 얘와 렘바 보니 다이나 아니 다 가서서 풍보다 다그남 풍보다 다그남 단점도 세바레서 추지나네 매바 인세티 바레
기타메 매베 So this is exactly as is explained in the basic verses on the middle way by the Master Nagarjuna, the basic wisdom. Where it says that if there So this is saying exactly the same thing, that if one holds, or at the time when there's no self, which is other than that which it takes up. Here, that which it takes up is a term for the aggregates. The aggregates are appropriated by the self when they're taken up, and so if there was no self. That's apart from, except for that which is taken up, the aggregates, then, and if that would be the case, if that was the case, then the self would be identical with that which is taken up, the aggregates, that which is appropriated, and if that's the case, then yourself is non-existent. You're saying, Master Nagarjuna is saying that for someone who holds that the self and the aggregates, the self is the appropriator or that which takes up the aggregates are that which is appropriated or taken up. If those two are identical, then all of these, there's a complete collapse of identity between the two, and there would be no way to differentiate them, and then such a self would be pointless or wouldn't exist at all.
that 되게 전부대 친다. 다도 개발한바 되면서 타와스. 다 만보 타위 견데 라라 소위 가사 찔라양. 다 가서를 풍부 두마 여바 친도 가사제 두마 여바 주대 나다 풍부니 어디 예매 직접 선되거나 직접되거나 아니다. 가사 찔라양 풍부 두마 여바 친도 가사야 만보 여바 좋아다. 야나 풍부 찔레 풍부를 가사 찔레면 와나시 풍부나 직도 주대 직당 가사 직당 다 풍부다 가사니 어디 직 예매 직 임비치 가사다 그와 직당 예매지 직 풍부대 가사 직다 예매지 직 임비치.
So then the second fault that would obtain would be that the self would become multiple. There would be multiple selves, and that fault would obtain. And this is explained in that Rangsui
가사치라스 다다다 풍부니어디 오예메 그 직이나 타다 때문에 그 직이나 이와침 나 라라소의 가사치라야 풍부 두마 여바 진신 신도 풍부가 여와 풍부 두마 여바 신도 가사야만 보여봐 주신스.
So either a person such as oneself or other persons as well, if they're unitary, they're single things. There's a single self. There's other persons are single persons, and that being, while that's the case, the aggregates are multiple. There's 5 aggregates. Then, if the person was identical with the aggregates, its basis of designation, then the person as well, if it was absolutely identical with its basis of designation, then the person as well would be end up being multiple, would be a multiple. Or, on the other hand, the aggregates would end up being a single thing, because they're identical with the person. Absolutely identical with the person, which is a single thing.
Oh yeah. 대단해 주발에 가제 풍부다 하나 대제지 마이면 다데 다자 만보 주루 세가라 다다 풍부 니어데 타자 예미 정오 예미 그 지이나 아니 풍부가와 예요 나 여바나 신체지 다야 나 여그 안다 만보 타와다. 그와 다 찔레면 봐 신도 한 풍부야 찔레면 봐 타와 그 견이요 인자 가제 풍부다나 대제제 마외 다제 다자 만보 주로 사지 다 만보 타위 줘와데 템.
And this is exactly as it's explained also in the introduction to the Middle Way, where it says, if the aggregates were the self, then at that time, because they're multiple, that is, the aggregates are multiple, then the self as well would become multiple.
그래서 다 지니 지제라 간소래 다 지지견도 줘야 돼. 가제 풍부 다 있나 재단 집안 니도죠. 세대 다 잡아셔로 그 중디. 다다 풍부 니오데 타자 예매지 지지 있나? 아니 풍부 지지 잡아 신도 다 지지 쳤고 그래. 좋아. 풍부 지지 잡아 신도. 풍부 진지 제바 신도 다시 지네. 아니 세디 풍부 가지고 가나 다야 가고 그래스. 아니 다디 제와 치면 면적이 다 유지해 용 거래와. 이제 인자 풍부 진지 제바 신도 다야 지지 제바 주대스. 풍부를서 다 매비체.
So the third fault that would obtain would be that the self would be something that would arise and disintegrate. It would possess the properties of arising and disintegration. So here this is explained also from the basic verses of the basic wisdom. It says that if the aggregates were the self, then the self would be something that would arise and disintegrate. And that's the quotation. And it says, just as the aggregates arise and disintegrate, then the self too would be such that it would arise and disintegrate, because there would be no self apart from the aggregates. And if that was the case, then when the aggregates disintegrate, then the self would cease to exist. The continuity of the self would disintegrate along with the disintegration of the aggregates.
다 주인차비 주지 진지 척거에 어디 대단한 풍봉아 진지 풍봉아지 주인차비 주지 진지 척바 신도 다장 주인차비 진지 척을 세가라 다 세디 수지 풍봉 세치만 먼저 와 세디 풍봉아 세치만 먼저 와 싶다 대나 신체의 순거다 풍봉아지 주인매저 진지 척바 다자 주인차비 진지 척을 사면 양대지 세 다장 윤차바 타와서 주다 오면 되발라 트디에서 다 라면은 되겠지 다 윤차바 정가데 제말 전도 지라마에 두고 알아와 품보 윤차바 두고 알아와 뒤에 다 윤차바 두고를 베스 요 윤차바 주게 품보 윤차 다마 윤 마체스 양한데서 나만 다체 줄을 쓰고는 세대 오면와라 미드부터 파워 펜버 인산 더바다서 거네 오면와 체점 지도기 풍부 주의체 다음에 주의마체 순고리 인산 대라 여바들라 하면양대 제다 주의체바 타와데 풍부 주의체바 타와서 좀더 오마기 랑그 더발라티네 고바남장 아니 미버장 그래서 미버장 간도다 하고서데 고프티 술을 팸브레 체락 마와야
So then if that was the case, that the self ceased to exist when the aggregates disintegrate, then that would be the problem would arise that just as here when we have the aggregates, there's a stream of continuity that occurs from the past to the present, and then it ceases. And just as that stream of continuity of the aggregates arises and disintegrates, similarly, then it would be the case that the continuity of the self would come to an end. There would be a stoppage of that continuity, and one would have the self arising and disintegrating in the same way that the aggregates arise and disintegrate. And if that was the case, then at the time of the when one achieves nirvana without remainder, then the continuity of the self as well would come to an end. And this fault which would obtain is something that one can apply to the lower schools of Buddhist philosophy, such as the Vaibhashikas, some of whom believe that there's an actual cessation of the continuity of the person when one achieves nirvana without remainder. And so one can take that and use these rejections here within the process. These refutations that are being presented here, one can sort of draw them from the dialectic that is had with the Vaibhashikas and apply them within one's own context of examining the nature of the self and the relationship between the self and the aggregates.
청아지니보데 개왕마다 치마다 오데 아니 엉아지다고 또발라 지도 나신 에 동을 지도 나신 나와다를 아니 지기나 마치 다니거든 에 다이나 아니 다다 란디수 랑게 개왕마시 아마테 마시와 아마테 시마심바 주데 시마심바티데 라니 단테다 지임비치 라니 단다 마시와 나신 개왕하면 마테야 시마심바주데 테다 지임비치 라니 테다 지임비치 와 아니 랑게 청아마데 시마심바야 주데 라니 테다 지임비치 아세 청아미 가사데 마시와 데게와 주데 테 다다 란다 지임비치
So then, So then other faults would, moreover, there would be additional irreconcilable problems that would arise. So here, if we think about how is it that one's own past and future, previous and future lives appear, that is, or even within one's own life, how what occurred, let's take it over the course of continuity of lives. One's previous life arose, and then now one has been born into this life. And if the self and the aggregates were absolutely identical, such that they couldn't be differentiated, then and if they appeared when they appear to thought, as if they're unitary, they're identical, and if they existed as they appear in that way, when at times within our thought it appears as if the aggregates and the self are the same thing. And if they actually existed in the way that they appear at that time, then these major problems would arise. That is, like right now, we exist at this current time, and if we were identical, if our self and our aggregates were absolutely identical, then it would be the case that we would not have died in our former life before we were born in this life, because we ourselves would be identical with that if the self and the aggregates are identical. And then likewise, it would be the case that the person that existed within that previous life would have been born in this life without having died. Those sorts of faults would arise, because oneself right now and oneself then would be absolutely identical, such that oneself now and oneself then couldn't be distinguished in any way whatsoever.
Oh yeah, 되게 두제되라. 자식 가도 가들 할때 미테나 미이나 대단하네 따봐줘. 가들 할때 미테나세도 두대사 미이나세. 또 미테나세 내나세 올하데 가들 하당 하데 가들 할때 미테나 내가 tenye taba juru se ane kewa ngama ki lade ane o cheti mete da ni bode ane tada yeme chi chi insona ane kewa ngami kase lade tada nya gore te ina tenda wa lade keji jiba ma yiba ane taba juwa ro.
So if this was the case, if this intrinsically existent I and the intrinsically existent aggregates were intrinsically identical, then we would have problems like that God that we were in a previous life would be the human we are right now. And that being the case, that these would be permanent. There would be no change that could occur within them. That is, that God that we were in the past would continue to exist now, and there would be no way to differentiate between how one existed in a previous life and the way one exists in a current life.
Oh yeah, 풍부 가대 풍부 다이나 깨는 집어 전도 주로 세대기 아니 가서라 동호 탈때도 이 나누다지 지이나 또발라 지도 나고리 대단한 동호 탈때 나와로 대체의 건딱 지도 받들라 다니 왔지 좀아 다니까라 대단한 시도 탈때 봐 교진 람 대단한 동호 지도 많이 봐 안에 또발라 탈때도 나시 나와 인발라 유마대베 ngaji tobani ngaji da osi ro je wa ngaji da bo tobala tada do na shi na wa da imbale yue ma de be telani gyusum jide la sumba ki sta ka so de di ma sungu wa da je wa ji ba mi ri ba dang se de tobala tada do na shi na wa le yue ma tobala tada do na wa ina 안에 타다 인고를 들어 드메 텐션 인고를 드메 텐션 이나 안에 교수님 인고를 뒤집어 미리 바탕 다 담보되라 교수님 주제를 쓰면 담보되 뒤집어 미리 바탕 미리데 저와 미비실
그냥 이 배저 신도 다 체벌 줄
대단 신도 타제발 다 찍도 캐라나 다 대다 위냐와 대단한 신도 타제발 조신
So if you accept it that way, that the that the self and the aggregates are identical in that way, that if they're appearing to one's thought as though I and the basis of designation, the aggregates are the same, then all of those various kinds of faults obtain. As mentioned, the self would be multiple, or the aggregates would be singular. The self would undergo, would disintegrate, cease to exist, and so forth. All of those problems would occur, and that would be extremely bad. It would be extremely bad. And if one doesn't accept it like that, if you don't accept those things, then if you think that, well, there's such things as past lives and future lives, and those appear to our thought as though they're different, and if they exist, since it's impossible that they could be other than the way they appear to our thought in that way as different, and here one has to specify that in our ordinary appearance, these things, when they're appearing differently, when we think I am and my former aggregates are intrinsically different, then various other faults arise. Here there's 3 faults that are enumerated from the commentary on the Introduction to the Middle Way. The first of these is that it would be inappropriate to include the self and the aggregates within a single continuum because they would be unrelated.
Oh yeah, that had a ina. You some kind of digital mirror by the career, and I think I knew what the Java Maris. Right? Java Meba Cares and the Javala and Dachi the teaching Java study Niga Chenasha. Dachi made it, Ranshin so and now so to which. Dachivala Ranchi Chibajuares, Mochiba. Either Ranchi Soso and now what are Soso now what are Trube, Dachikava Madu. Tejunga Java Medide, Penzi Rale Meba. Machi Date, Javanga Mitate, Chimala Ramale, Chimala, Chimidati, Avala Ramale, Penzi Rale Meba, now what a Tribiche.
So the reason they would be that absence of any kind of relation whatsoever is that on the one hand they wouldn't have an identity relation because they're established the way they appear as if they have they appear intrinsically different, and therefore they would have to exist that way. And then they also would be devoid of any kind of causal relationship because just as they appear, they wouldn't exist without having any kind of mutual dependence upon each other.
Dindachidu Jedo, Silicana Pena, my tweet and a Jawanga Lunis Jawa, Suana Sichani. Tweet and did tweet Dindachidu Jedo, said a Jawa Chamber Mirite, Hejing Jawa, Hejing Rangi Jawa Chambana, Rani, Chichin to Jawa Mitambashi, Hejing Jawa Chichin Mitabana, Hejing Jawa Chichin Mitabani, or Ranzen, the meditation in the Deva, or Tenashitani, the Atene, Jawa Chamber Mirite. The
So here the reason for this is that if it was incorrect, if one couldn't demonstrate that they belong to a single continuum, then it would be impossible to have memory of one's birth, such as when one thinks, I at that time, at that point in my life, or at that time, at that particular occasion, I was such and such. I existed in such and such a form, and here, so it would be illogical or irrational to have any kind of recollection of one's birth, and it would be sort of like it would be sort of like the way that if person A, when they think about their own birth, they're unable to recall the birth of person B. They don't think of themselves. Here the terms that are used are Devadatta and Yajnadatta, two sort of like names for for individuals. When person A, that is Devadatta, remembers when he was born, he doesn't think that Yajnadatta was born. That's not the way it works.
Oh yeah, ani le chawa chi sawa ase charanga ma ki ani khasa digi ana juji be gewa khasa digi le gewa da me gewa chawa la ani dewu de du chungwa de ani o me yom rangi khasa re dewu de rang to me be minu ba yin zam ani chi sawa ju res rangi le sa ja ran da juji ba sui ja nyong wa me se bi chi se ga la 다 같이 유니오데 란잔이 주비 란잔이 주오면 아니 동을 타대 봐 이나 아니 데메 텐션 연구를 아니 티 가서 말지 그 가서래 개와다 미기 빌레지 대부 아니를 치마대라 멤멤바
So another fault that would obtain would be that it would be the case that that karma that one has created would not be experienced by oneself. That karma would not function to produce causes. I mean, to produce the results that it produces. The reason for this is that even though one had accumulated the karma oneself, there would be no one within one's own mental continuum that would be able to experience the result of that karma, because the self that existed in the past and the self that existed in the present, because they're intrinsically existing, they couldn't have any kind of relationship such that the self that functioned as the agent to perform the action would be able. There'd be no way to establish that self was the person that underwent the experience of the karma subsequently.
Oh, didn't that? 내 마셔와다 쳐봐다. 근데 내 마셔와다 쳐봐. 세대 규칙이 맞대. 니마치 뭔지 내기 더불어 lon자바남 내 마셔와다 쳐봐. 주대 아니 내 가서래 내 대다기 주남 알한다 규칙바 수이다 마사위치. 규칙바 마사위치. 디니 자실에 가데 디니 현주나 대면나야 중화 주로 세가나 당마지 뉴딜 알한자지 주비 현이나 전에 아니 대면바야 중화 주로 야나 동어 타대도 직발라 로데 타대이나 타대 현주나 대면바야 중화 주로서 딜레 재산체를 딘데 지금으로.
So here then the third fault that would arise is that that one would experience the results of one would enjoy or experience the results of actions that oneself had not created. That is, one would come into contact with the results of karma that one had not previously created oneself. The reason for that is that there would be no one that's of the same mental continuum as oneself that would have accumulated the causes of those things that one is experiencing. This again is referring to the idea that when the self and the aggregates appear to us as if they're within our thought, as if they're different, and we misconceive them as existing intrinsically. Therefore, the self and the aggregates are intrinsically different. Then there's no way to establish any kind of causal relationship between prior and subsequent instances of oneself within that framework. So here this is explained in the basic wisdom of Master Nagarjuna. It says that if this one was other, that is, if this person now and the person that in the past who created the actions were actually intrinsically other than each other, they're intrinsically other, then that without that person in the past having existed, then this would arise for us. And 대신도 내규시.
대신들이 내규시 대마시와 겨와 줄시.
대마시와
아마도 마시와에 겨와 줄고.
대신도니 내규신.
대신 되니 내규신 세가나 채디네 아니 가데 채디네 와지 내가 주와 인상 채딩하대당 아마 그 많이 오디 이미 그 지기나 아마데 마시바야 드리게와 주와.
So likewise, then this I that existed in the past would continue to exist, and without it having died, it would be born here. And so that's the next couple of lines from that passage from the Root Wisdom. 체당 렌남 추사 체당
렌남 추사당 세리가라 아니 가사 준체바당 아니 레 제와 취사와 세간다 된다지 마치 다니오제 아니 란잔지 주 제이나 그러와 아니 레샤 말 양어지 아마기 가와시 그 레디 첨마디 란잔지 제위 제 란잔지 주비 아니 타달라 데메 텐션 요거와 인장 아니 말지 차랑아마 제베 레지 더부데 차라 치마가 가사테기 명령와 이자 레샤와 취사와기 그러다 취사와다 아니 레 마샤와다 차라 치마티기 아니 동안영화 레지나 명령와데 레 마샤와다 차바다 아마티기 제와 이나야 폰이 되면 대신 이제 마샤와다 차바다 시드니 가서래
So then other sorts of problems would arise that here this is again referring to the notion that the I exists by means of its own intrinsic identity, that the identity of the I is intrinsic, therefore it's not dependent upon anything extrinsic to it. It doesn't depend upon other things outside of itself. And that being the case, then the I existing now and the I that existed in the past, both of them which exist intrinsically have their own intrinsic identity. They would be such that they could have no relationship with one another because of that intrinsic identity that establishes them as being autonomous and not having depending upon anything outside of themselves. Outside of itself. So if that's the case, then such an I in the past would completely cease to exist and have no relationship to the I in the present. And likewise, the actions that the I in the past created would not have any effects for the I in the present. And then or on the other hand, then the actions that oneself created in the past would be experienced by some other person entirely. They would not be something that oneself would have to experience, and all of those and other faults would obtain.
Oh yeah, that did umajubicaso champagne. cham반에 벨레데 쳔남지 현이 지나 지지 도미데 간자란자니 소소와 지도 말 이마인세 되게 cham바다 예배나 신시잖아 유타대바니기 와 cham바기 내사바기 저부데 예배기 명령와 아니 예배기 내사비 저부데 cham바 명령 뭐 권이 주태된 바래 주태된 바 그러마 어디 잠시네 권이 주 대나시 전에 란잔지 주와 캐라나 아니 기왕 마치 균이오데 아니 지주도 떠와도 연구 말해 저 지주도 떠와도 지주도 뭐또 뭐이나 아니 콘도 샤바나신 차랑 아마게 가사되기 레차와디 겨와 가사 침마되기 미템바다 겨와 템바 미주와다 아마 디게베 레차와디 대우 침마디 명령와 인장 아니 명령와 이제 레차와 취사와다 침마디 대와 영와디 겨와 아마 가사되기 많이 반자바 인장 레 마자와다 태빈여와디 오타 주주바 많이 바 인장 란잔지 TV 소소와라 주주바 메르비 진장기 아니 다녀와들이 중요한 말이야.
So all of these various faults would occur, and these are also, this same kind of line of argument is presented likewise in the introduction to the Middle Way, where it says that the dharmas which depend upon Maitri and Upagupta. These are two names, again, sort of chosen to illustrate two different persons. Jamba is Maitri and Nyepe is Upagupta. So the phenomena that depend upon those, because they're completely intrinsically different or other, then it's impossible to include them within a single continuum. Similarly, something which is established by means of its own intrinsic identity as being individuated or separated, those things, it's inappropriate to include those things within a single continuum. So this is summing up all of the different faults that would arise if the self and the I and the aggregates, which are its basis of designation, were intrinsically different. If that difference was established by means of intrinsic identity, that the self has its own intrinsic identity that doesn't depend upon something else, the aggregates are intrinsically identifiable as such. If that was the case, if they were different in that way, then there would be no way to establish causal relationships between prior instances of the self and subsequent instances of the self or I. There would be, you would have all kinds of faults that the I that created karma in the past, the current I would not experience the results of it, or the I in the present would have to experience results of karma that was not created by itself, by I. Those faults would obtain, that one wouldn't be able to remember events that occurred previous events within one's own lifetime, much less be able to recall previous lives, because the I in the past has no relationship with the I in the present, and those kinds of faults obtain. All of those other faults obtain as well.
Oh yeah, that thing. 가지 풍부 다이나 계단 주보전도 줄 시해기 풍부 다이나 다도 캐라 뭐 되면다 나 지주전도 주어라서 견 타니 아니 다 풍부 다이 다다 지인벌 니제 뭐뭐 토네 나한테 풍부다 라신지 주의 지금 뭐 인방에 와나 아니 다 라신 타대래 왜매 타대래 지금 뭐 있나 라신지 타대래 왜 타대래 마대와 다 타대도 나로 가래래서나 나한테 차서 풍부디 뜨니 차와 좀 마도 된도 아니 풍발라 타대 빛난주당 타대면 봐 아니 풍비 때문에 차와 좀 마도 된도 풍발라 타대 빛난주당 캠메라 풍비도 풍발라 타대 봐 데메 되잖기 난주당 제발 메라 대단하 풍부 뒤제수 선비 아니 풍부 뒤제수 선비 아니 천이 진직당 내와당 미담바 주대스 어디 가대 풍부 남래시 풍비 천이 매와 줄 싸워시로 특히 말해 풍부 남래시 풍비 천이 미담에서 하고서 안 되는 데 줄람사로 차지 타달의 연만에 대단하 나한테 차사 풍비 때문에 차와자 마도 된도 아니 풍발라 타대비 난주도 개발매 개발매라 대단하 다디 풍부 뒤제주 선비 아니 선이 지지다 내와 믿어 봐 주그래 와
나디 풍부 뒤다 랑신 지금만 예쁘네 랑신기 탈이래
타대이나 요요 말에 타대이나 다
So here then, thus, having seen all of these various objections that would obtain, faults that would occur, that is irreconcilable problems that would arise if you see the self and the aggregates as identical, then one thinks that once one has ascertained definitively that the I and that I and these aggregates could not be intrinsically identical, then since it's the case that if they exist intrinsically, that they would necessarily have to be intrinsically different, And then the way that appears to us, if they were intrinsically different, here then, other than that eye appearing upon the locus that it is designated upon, that is the aggregates, there's no other way that it can appear. That is, the eye appears when we think eye, and when the eye appears to us, it always appears in relationship to the aggregates. The aggregates are the basis upon which the eye appears. And so, in fact, then, if the eye was intrinsically different from the aggregates, then it would be the case that there would be no difference in dundu bombale tarepe nangsudan kepamela detana tak pumbul duchesusum sini kejikne
dundu bombale tarepe nandu chebayo mares dada
dundu bombale tarepe nangsu
아니 대단한 아니 가서 다들 풍부 뒤자주 준비 아니 진지답니다 뭐 최대 다단 파란하시래 다단 파란 대신도 주배 지그지 준비도 많으시래 So
then in fact, it would be the case that there would be no difference from the way in which a pot appears as different from the eye. There would be absolutely no difference at all. And if that was the case, then the self would not possess the characteristics which are. I'm sorry. If that was the case, then. Sorry, I'm getting tangled up again. So if that was the case, then the self would be such that it would not possess the characteristics which define the aggregates as being created things, that is, arising, abiding, and disintegration. Those are the defining characteristics of something which has been created by causes and conditions. Sometimes it's translated as compounded phenomena or some other translation, I'm not sure. But I'm translating that as created things that are created by causes and conditions. So if the self and the aggregates were intrinsically different, then the self could not possess the characteristics that are necessary to define the aggregates as being things that are created. That is, the self would not possess the properties of arising, abiding, and disintegrating. And it would be similar to the way that a horse and a cow are established as being other distinct things, because just like because things that are intrinsically different don't possess the same any of the same properties. They can't have the same characteristics. Similar to the way that a horse has specific properties, specific characteristics that define it as a horse, and those characteristics or properties are distinct from a cow. Cows have their own specific defining characteristics. And so then the self would be similar similar to the way that a horse is different from a cow, and it'd be the self would be have the similar kind of difference from the aggregates. And that being the case, then it wouldn't be able to possess the properties that define the aggregates as being created things. The self would not be able to arise, abide, and disintegrate.
아니 ngao nyamba ge nganjin henji ji nganjin henji ge da du sui 아니 가서 탄년 도비 시 미방 안진 henji ge 미바 가서래 미바지 탄년 도비 시 미바 미대 아니 미대바 와 ngao nyamba 좀 다데 ngao nyamba 집에 좀 henji ji da du 탄년 도비 시 미바 미대데 nganjin henji ge da du 탄년 도비 시 되라 아니 강사치 고고하리 니모제나 말리 지조라 달래 중화 로인이 총주진 다니 디유도 도체네 세 다디르와 탄년도 비시오 디인자 렌진 현지가 다도 탄년 집이시 몇번 미대디 다 진진 미대바인데 뒤마체 임비시 빼나나게 매도 양대시
So if the self then didn't possess those characteristics of arising, enduring, and disintegrating, then it would be unacceptable for it to function as the observed object, which is upon which is designated with the convention of I or self. By the natural or innate form of the misapprehension which thinks of I. That would be unacceptable because the I or self would be an uncreated thing. For example, like a flower born in the sky, or like nirvana.
Oh yeah. 가대 풍부 남래시 풍부 천님에 봐 주셔야 돼. 가대 풍부 남래시 풍부 천님에 봐 주시소. 아니 다 풍부 천이제 아니 풍부 뒤에 준비 아니 제지답니다. 봐 주레스 제제. 시소. 신양 풍부 때는 매비시. ngao nyambaki lo jimi jewa 신도 풍부 매비 사줘라야 ngao nyambaki lo jimi jewa 용거레스. jewa 신도 랑그 풍부 때는 매비 시양 아니 ngao 그 로지미지 아니 지미서 주지 풍부 때는 매비 시양 ngao 그 로지미지 스버 주대 코니 지 스버 주대 다다 풍부니 오데 아니 제我现 인의 대매 태생 인고와 인장 안 됐은 거야 봐 스버 주대 자실에 가데니와 렘발라 셰도 태바 마이 니마이 가지 시에나 레메바 수유레나 순두리 메 다시 제가 저를 정말 느꼈다.
자실 나마.
내가 나마도 좋다. 된다.
라게 하고마소.
자시 가냐.
당일 니와 렘팔레 신도 테이파 니마인. 대신은
아니 니와 렘발라 아란잔 가지 신도 테바 원이바 말했어. 是吧?当年我连把那先都太把你马云是这个啦，现在我太太把你对太把马云让真就是我太太把你是吧？看的现在连没把是呢，你我太太把你呢，你你我连把不没把样送有人那样，你送都没，现在碰不些的也给单碰不单年没把给你们的送人，
碰给你们吧。 So therefore it says in the root wisdom as well that if the aggregates, if the self was other than the aggregates, that is intrinsically other than the aggregates, then it would not possess the characteristics of the aggregates. It says that, and the sub-commentary explains that, saying, moreover, just as it's the case that an sort of uncontrived thought of I am, arises upon in a locus where there is which is entirely devoid of something like a pot. That is, when one observes a pot, one doesn't think I. One doesn't think that is me. So the I, the thought I, which is not artificially contrived, but just occurs naturally, always occurs in a place such as is a place which is entirely devoid of something like a pot. And similarly, if that was the case, then it's rangi pumbu tini me pe shiriang ngao nyampe.
Tene me be xiang ngao nyampe lo jimi jesiba juti. Pumbu me be xiang ngao nyampe lo jimi jesiba.
So if the self and the aggregates were intrinsically different, that is, they possess their own intrinsic identity, which makes them different in a sort of absolute sense, then it would be possible for one to give rise to
아니 녀와 렘발라 현도 태바 마인도 스타데 녀와 레비 품보라 아니 뭐 타자 보라 전주 주비 현도 태바니 마인스 좋아 가디 현나 레메베스 가나 란전지 주비 현이나 니레기 품보 매밤 아니 다순도 요거와래 순도 저나 니레 품보 마소바 다순도 매바
So then it would be the case that it would be possible for one to give rise to an uncontrived thought which thinks I am, even in a location where there's absolutely no form of one's own aggregates whatsoever. So that sort of a completely absurd consequence would obtain if the self or I and the aggregates were intrinsically different, had possessed intrinsic identity, which would entail that they don't have any kind of a relationship to each other. And so this is illustrated likewise from the root wisdom again, where it says, if to have the self be other than that which it appropriates, here that which it appropriates is a shorthand for the aggregates, that's completely unacceptable. It's undemonstrable. If they were other in that way, meaning if they possessed intrinsic identity, which makes them other than each other in a absolute or intrinsic way, then without having the aggregates present at all, it would be, one would apprehend the I or the self, and that would be okay, but it's not the case that we do that. We don't apprehend the I or the self in the absence of the aggregates, which are its basis of designation.
Oh yeah. That uma juba layang. Teji pumbo la xian da me de pumbo ma do tenze ma du chi. Pumbo la ngo xian me xian ba ge da yo ma re. Te yo na ane pumbo ma zo wa la, pumbo ma sun ba la, pumbo lo yu do ma sun ba da lo yu do chu ba chu go de te me wa yi za.
So the same thing is said in the introduction to the Middle Way, where it says, therefore there's no self which is other than the aggregates. Here again, one has to specify that the other dimension of this, or the difference from the aggregates, is a kind of intrinsic or a kind of difference which is established by means of intrinsic identity, not just in general. And so here, then, there is no self other than the aggregates, because it's never the case that we apprehend the self or the I, except for in relationship to the aggregates.
lo la che jing a ga cha da chen che ji wa ta da lo na ta da nga yin san bi nga wo do de pa da ba za ma yin ba ming ge dan xi chuo bi za min pung su chuo bi zhen de pa da ba za ma yin ba ani nga ko rang ge chu de na wa de ko rang ge ne chu de na wa de le su ni o ten da we ga ji da de le su ni ten da we ga ji da de ye na 아니 다중 공도 샤바 나신 그 같이 다 나데 풍부 대당 라신 지지당 타대 가루네 예매배 타제네 지기나 아니 나당 아이시 다당 풍부 타대의 조비 아니 타녀비 참아 탐제래 내봐 좋그래 나당 아이시 다분이 타대의 조비 타녀비 참아 탐제지 아니 내봐요 그래 지기나니 지기나 나당 아이와시 지금 뭐인 받아 다분 타대도 주베 타녀비 참아 여기실 참아 타녀비 참아 주기실 내가 좋아 그래서 하고 저한테
So in brief, right now when we think I am, when we think about that, then that's this sort of authentic form of the I that appears to us in this genuine form of the I that appears to us, again, in our ordinary everyday experience without any kind of philosophical analysis of it or investigation of it. Then if that existed such that it wasn't merely something that was designated upon its basis of designation, if it arises from its own side then, and appears to us in that way, then we have to apprehend it like in the way that it appears to us as if it existed on its own side. As if it had its own sort of autonomous identity in that way. Take it up, sort of hold that in our minds, and then we think if that existed, it would have to exist such that it is either intrinsically identical with these aggregates, or it is intrinsically different from those aggregates. One of those two alternatives. There's no other third alternative than apart from those two. And then once we've determined that, ascertained that, then we think if it was identical, then this would be refuted or rejected by all of the forms of conventional valid knowledge which establish the self and the aggregates as different. When we think I and mine, those kinds of thoughts, when we think I am this, this is my body or this is my mind, belongs to me, then those are valid, conventionally valid cognitions. And if the I and the aggregates, which are its basis of designation, were absolutely identical, then those conventional valid cognitions would not be valid. They wouldn't obtain at all. But those conventional valid cognitions demonstrate that that the I can't be identical with its basis of designation.
Oh yeah, that Demetation Yungo, and then you do a title Demetation Yungo, you know, my da Pumbotam Bitambata. Any Pumbola Mate and that Pumbola Mate was so, I never Mambo daughter but Tony. That and the or Tsunayaki, Moto Partabata Mayimba, Rangana Truaki, Madi, and any or Rangi, Rongara, number kundu Mezu Yimba la. Number kundu meba chungba yimba la tome ne tabara yeme toche tanya manyowa yesha chewa ki ane machung are ranzen chibe ngadi yesha chewa machung
yesha chewa machung
yo shisha chane.
So here then if the self and the aggregates were different, again, specified in the sense of if they possessed intrinsic identity and that difference between them existed in a sort of intrinsic fashion, then it would be the case that the self would not possess the aggregates, and the self would exist without depending upon the aggregates. All of those kinds of irreconcilable faults would obtain, and it would be impossible to avert those problems that would occur. So having seen that, then we recognize that this I, and here we have to specify that it's the I that appears to us sort of ordinarily, the sort of naturally appearing I in our everyday experience, but which appears as if it's intrinsically existent or possesses its own intrinsic identity. That I is completely similar in all respects to the horns of a rabbit. That means it's totally non-existent, and so up from the beginninglessly, without any beginning, up into the present, it's never been the case that we've experienced this kind of analysis of whether this thing exists or not.
Oh yeah, Tani. And tender with long and the Langshola don't mean yes, Yasha Yamba long and the Langshola, and they don't mean Yamba Singer, that don't she says to the Insamatonia, 동 미년 양바 랑슈지 덴투바 첸네 삼로지 덴투바 첸네 가자테 된다 어떤데 랑글로라 샤해기 아라왕이 가자테 가점지 메가 아니 메가 동상경아래 세다티 텐데 가자데 가점지 메가 동상경아라 뭐 시내지 값을 냠바쇼 지도 차
So then, now we, at that point, once you've recognized that up to this point in time, without any beginning, one has never properly investigated the way in which this I sort of naturally appears to us, and determined that it's the appearance is not does not coincide with the way it exists. So we've never engaged in that kind of, we've never experienced that kind of investigation and analysis of that, and it's because of not having done that it arises. So now then we think that thinking that this bad sort of thought that we've sort of pampered in this way, this misconception of the I, it comes about sort of by its own force. It arises without any kind of necessitating any kind of special effort on our part, and then so once we've identified it in that way, then we have to
라완도 주변아 다시 공도 셰기 좋아 가차테 가점지 아니 동산 메가 메가 데마도 셴 칸야 로라 마차 체체 동산 메가 동산 딩아래 아니 안가지 지내지 값이 샤바다 다 냠바 조치도 차신 냠산
So then once one's done that and thought about how, you know, this bad sort of way of thinking about oneself has occurred, and then one thinks, sort of automatically will think that will engage, having engaged in that analysis and determine that it doesn't exist, that it's really just a fiction, the completely unreal and not even phenomenally existing, it's a mere fiction. Then, then within the state of a kind of vacuity, which is a simple negation, being the mere negation of that object of negation, meaning the intrinsically existent I, then once one is in that state of vacuity, which is the simple absence of that object of negation, then just as has been explained within the context of, previously within the context of developing shamatha, then one should meditate upon that in sort of a meditative absorption, remain in that meditative absorption on that simple negation for as long as one is able to.
Oh yeah, 동상 경계시대 세가나 메가 동상대 아니바 테나 제주도냐 바샤 인자 되게 동상 의외시대 양 숙신도 좋나 아니 가짜랑 텐다 여바다 공도 셔바기 아니 내시된 저당 라시메바 두바기 아니 루치 텐데 라서기 아니 타야바 삼네 아니 대 어디 동상 등의시대 내시대 그 말게봐 말게지 안된 뒤 귀네 아니 지내 쳐바니 냠샤나 갔다 위 존주래.
So then, at that point, then one's gained a kind of ascertainment of this vacuity. The vacuity here is not a general, any kind of vacuity, but refers specifically to that, the negation, this simple negation, which is the absence or which occurs as a result of having negated that object of negation. And so one remains upon that, in that meditative absorption for as long as one is able. And when one's ascertainment of that vacuity, the power of it starts to weaken, then one should return to the sort of refutations of that sort of the existence of that sort of nature, which is the object of negation, as previously described, and then also think about all of the different ways in which different kind of evidence and proof which establishes the non-existence of that object of negation, and then regenerate the force of that ascertainment that one has, that the ascertainment of that vacuity, which is the mere negation of the object of negation there. And so doing that, then and preserving the continuity of the force of that ascertainment for as much as one is able to, that is called the way in which one maintains the meditation here and the meditative equipoise, which is like space.
Oh yeah, that didn't shit tell us that umitawa said that umitawa see tiny yudan trawi and tawa the topi. The Tony de Beloins umitawa said that umitawa the Chitan Ujitawa, the Umijang Ni Chani, Ula Tawa Square, soon so you are, you don't buy Nila. I need a toby, I need Tawala, I need Inzang umitawa said, Neshitelas, umitawa she said. Tawati, I need a member top of my young. Tawa Tigi, I don't need to be single day, don't you see be single, I need a member. I never check. Top of my young, don't you even know what damage to someone is. And you know, wrong the truth, but then maybe you, because you know, wrong when and then maybe never tattoo much about it.
So that ascertainment then is what is called the Madhyamaka view. Here, Madhyamaka view has two aspects or sides to it. One would be the Madhyamaka view of the object, or then there's also Madhyamaka view of the subject. Here, this is referring to the object side of that. And so that view, it doesn't, although it doesn't it doesn't realize the non-existence of the I. It's not realizing the non-existence of the I, but rather within the specific perspective of the view, which is ascertained emptiness, which is what's under discussion here, that I is completely non-existent within the perspective of that ascertainment of emptiness. And this is what is called the introduction to the way things exist, which is that they are completely non-existent, that all objects are completely non-existent from their own side or objectively.
Oi, don't you even know what damage to someone, you know, ranking when I damage in Nelutatu Motrava race, Ricana, Mate, and the Tony having or Mabati, my Nelutatu in body. My Nelutatus. Sume, Drame, Chume, Rome, Sesharamabusuma, Sesharanibukaya, Meme Seade, Sude, Suji Chunisi, Singor Meba, Suji Nelutadu. Dai Chunisi, Singor Nelumeba, and Dai Nelutadu, Chayana, to Staguare.
So here then, so it is the case then within the perspective of that ascertainment of the emptiness here that the I is non-existent. And that applies to all phenomena. That is, within the perspective of the vision that understands the reality, there's no appearance of phenomenal things like the I, or like in the Heart Sutra, where we say there's no physical form, there's no sound, smell, taste, no visible form, no sound, no smell, no taste. In all cases, what that means is that the final nature of those phenomenal things is that they're non-existent within the perspective of this vision that perceives the reality underlying the reality of them.
도시 통화면은 sem바 통화면 대가서 통화 배신지제 예바 뉴바미 세야당 수는 미동 초와다자 미동시 세야되기 내루시비 생으로 수다 초와다 도시라서 마동와데 아니 통화 배신지제 예바 마이미 세가라 아니 마동와는 통화 탐바고 전에 수완나시 전에 리시기 생으로 먼저 수라서 마동와데 통화 탐바 내루 통화 이자 통화 배신지제는 봐 마이스 배신지 예바 뉴바 마이스
통화 배신
통화데 배신지 아니 유튜브 말에서 예만
So here then, this is similar to what is explained in the brief form of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, that where the verse Samchayagata, where it says that the best kind of seeing is not seeing. What that is referring to then is that within the perspective of this vision that sees the final nature of things, none of these phenomenal things appear within it. That is form, visible forms, sounds, etc. Or within the aggregates, one can speak of the physical aggregate, the aggregate of sensation, aggregate of ideation, activity, consciousness, all of those aggregates. Within the perspective of this vision that sees the final nature of them, those phenomenal things don't appear to any degree whatsoever. And so that not seeing of the phenomenal things and instead seeing their final nature is said to be the best kind of seeing.
Oh yeah. What about Yimbas? I watch about Yimbas, said the Kondushabanashin, Jenny, Yunarangan, and damn me, Nelu Tatu, and watch about Yinda, Takaran, John Mato, Takaran, Nelu, no, Nelu Tatu, Takaran, John Mato, Tadu Rashi, Meto, she, Gajak Chabas, and a sort of Toyato. And a tanya them to Yambaki, and a Rashi made a tanya them to Yambaki, and a castle. 대리게 도방 원주지 원주 쳐봤다고 양사 정가도 미리서 삼로동에 요 말이었어. 양사 정가가
So within the context of this this meditative equipoise, which is seeing the final nature of things, the ultimate nature of phenomenal things, the phenomenal things themselves are not appearing. And so within the context of that maintenance of that meditative equipoise, other than preserving that specific understanding of the object of the absence of the object of negation, that simple vacuity, which is the result of the elimination of the object of negation, that emptiness. Then, apart from that, one doesn't develop. One shouldn't newly sort of designate things by thinking like these things don't exist by means of their own intrinsic nature, or thoughts such as these things merely exist conventionally. These exist as mere conventions. Those sorts of thoughts one shouldn't produce within the context of this maintenance of the meditative equipoise in this context.
Oh yeah. Then Jesu nyamshala lambi Jesu anengawo nyambe toba undu chewa zamji nga nyambaki te toba undu chewa zamji ngai chache ane sadun la sowa dresen ane o jedo ku chache la shubi tusu yang sadun la sobe chawa che ane jedo ku chawa la ane shubi tusu yang gacha rangshin ji chuwa me bi nge sheda ma chawa gacha nami ane gacha rangshin ji chuwa na yang rangshin ji ma chuwa ane gyumi chazu ji kwane yamatobe chazu.
So then, after you've arisen out of that meditative equipoise, then when once again there will be the arising of thoughts which think I, and those will become manifest again, and within the mere sort of appearance of that kind of thought of I, then one engages in the sort of activities of the I. So here, like eating and drinking and so forth, one goes out and does all of the activities that the I is engaged in. And during that time as well, without being separated from that ascertainment of the non-existence of the object of negation, so one goes about one's everyday life, but carries over into those everyday activities, that ascertainment that one's already achieved that the object of negation is non-existent. And so with thinking about the I in that way, then this is the way in which
가자 낭다낭 그때 나와대 아니 주마 찾주지 권에 주마다 나라나 셈바바 주마 찾주지 권에 아니 랑게 다시 저 랑게 다시 가데 랑게 답시 컴투발 컴투 듀발라 때네 아니 아시 파다와 잠시래 땀 잠시래 렌데 잠시래 잠시라 아니 렌데지 땐도 내네 저 렌데 요 내내 나도니조 아라시지 주와 나야 안에 나도 라시지 주베 땅비 나도 니저수 안에 다 샤와지 고그레스 샤고그레스 템메데스 가르스인데 하고
So then so in that way then one One preserves that in the post-meditative, after one's arisen out of meditative equipoise, one preserves this in that way by having the object of negation appear as like a magical illusion. What that means is that when one arises out of meditative equipoise, even though one has ascertained that the object of negation is non-existent in the course of that meditation, nevertheless, when one arises out of that, the I reappears. One thinks of it, it appears as if it's intrinsically existent, has its own sort of autonomous character or intrinsic identity, and so that will reappear. But because one has already ascertained that it doesn't exist in the way it appears, then that way of carrying out one's everyday activities is called the way in which the object of negation appears as like a magical illusion. And then one thinks that, and by means of that mode of carrying out one's everyday activities, one thinks that that this I, which is the this I, which is merely superimposed or designated upon its own specific basis of designation, that is the collection of the 6 elements. That mere I is the basis for karma and its results. One definitely ascertains that merely that I, which is merely designated upon its basis of designation, is the basis for karma and the results of karma. And when that occurs, then that's what is called the appearance of emptiness and So that's when, so it's appearing, and it's simultaneously one has ascertained that it's empty. So appearance and emptiness appear combined together in a composite. The two are collected together. So it appears as if it's intrinsically existent, but one knows that it's empty. So those two are brought together in that way.
tun lame guzerobten jing nam thartin le jok